Meditation itself is a form of profound insight into our mental habits. Sometimes we feel like there has to be something dramatic happening, like there has to be some fireworks that go off when we're feeling enlightened. And it's a paradox because there is nothing to attain. There's nowhere to go. Your experience is right here, right now. Whether you go to the top of Everest to find your peak experience, when you can experience it right here, right now, wherever you may be. So we feel sometimes that we're far from the peace and joy that we long for. We tell ourselves if we follow what someone else is experiencing, that there's success that other people have, and that maybe if we did what they did, we would be enlightened like they are. But this longing often leads us just to compare ourselves to others. You know, the truth that we're really seeking is waking up, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, the illusion of our separateness. No one else's journey can be ours, and everyone's journey is each other's reflection of our own experiences. And we're all connected, we're all interdependent on these causal connections, and if we realize that, then love becomes a stronger force for all of us to stay true to ourselves and have a responsibility to the planet and taking care of each other. I love this question. It's the question of how did we all get here, right now? Well, you know, if you trace my presence here today, I think one of the strongest causal threads throughout my life has been a fascination with consciousness in general, how the mind shapes experience, how it limits us, how it liberates us. That curiosity really started long before I ever stepped into a laboratory setting. And you alluded to this one experience I had in my childhood. I used to run cross country. Long distance running back in high school. And I just remember this one particular race. It was pouring rain, Staples High School in Westport, Connecticut. Nobody was really happy to be there. It was cold, wet. The trails were muddy. My shoes were soaked. Everyone's shoes were soaked before we even started running. I was a bit anxious. We're standing around wondering if the race was still on. You know, some of the best runners in our division were there, but they were complaining loudly. They were like, this is going to suck. The rain's going to slow me down. And then I overheard one of their coaches say that this isn't the day for a personal best. Just try to finish. And when I heard that, amidst my own anxiety and wishes to cancel the race and go home, I was cold. Somehow that relaxed my own mind. And it was like a switch that my mindset shifted to, I got this. And then, with a smile on my face, I did run my best race ever in the pouring rain, beating my goal. 6-minute miles was always my goal in high school. So I came in about third place. I came ahead of the two guys complaining at the start. And I just remember that day really vividly. And that race taught me something that I've never really forgotten. And that it is that our mind can be our greatest limitation or our greatest liberation, really. And so that developed into just deep fascination with the mind, how it works, how it shapes our experiences, how it impacts our human potential. And I think that insight really pulled me deeper into understanding how the mind works. I started taking philosophy and religion courses along neuroscience in university. And during my junior year, I attended my first 10-day Goenka-style Vipassana retreat. So it was a deep dive into silence and awareness. And it was profoundly transformative, not just emotionally, but I think neurologically. Like I started believing and feeling how the brain was learning how to quiet itself, how to observe, how to release. And that, I think, experience also connected the dots between ancient wisdom and modern science. I saw that Buddhist and Vedantic traditions weren't just spiritual, and they weren't really just religion. They were early forms of cognitive science from my point of view. They were describing the mechanisms of attention, emotion regulation, and perception. And of course, this was long before I ever started doing fMRI research. So that sort of led me to this, I think, the backbone of how I see mind-body research, really. Like I've been focusing on meditation, yoga, and breath work for over 20 years, and how those practices specifically can influence the brain, how they can improve health and healing and human potential. There's one other piece that's probably worth reflecting on here, and it's still an area that fascinates me at the intersection, really, between Buddhist philosophy and modern neuroscience. And there's this idea of dependent origination. I often talk about this idea when we talk about why we're here. How did we get to where we are right now, right? Like, why did anybody click on this podcast today? The Buddha described dependent origination as this web of causes and conditions, really, that nothing exists on its own. Nothing happens in isolation. Every moment, every thought, and every relationship is a product of this complex network of causal influences. The Dalai Lama has been very influential in my life. And he often will say that understanding interdependence is essential, not just to seeing how suffering arises, but to realizing how liberation happens. There's a great quote by Sogyal Rinpoche, who said, if we are interdependent with everything and everyone else, including your listeners, even our smallest thoughts and our actions can ripple throughout the universe. And this is not just poetry, it's neurobiology. And I think what I've come to realize is that every emotion you feel is a cascade of causes and conditions, genes interacting with hormones, neurons firing in patterns that are sculpted by your entire life history. Maybe you also had an experience running in the rain or some profound insight in high school. Whatever it was, it shapes us to what this causal chain of events that lead to where we are today. So this dependent origination idea is not some metaphysical concept. It's happening right now. Every listener that's tuning in, at this exact second is here because of billions of causal threads that lead you to some experience of who you are and what you're doing today. And in this moment, if you're listening, something made you click play. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was coincidence, maybe it was karma. Whatever the cause, this moment is part of the same vast web of interdependence. And we'll come back to this idea because it speaks directly to mental health. But I think it's worth pointing out to your audience that this web of interdependence in which we all are part of makes what is deeply experienced as being human sacred, and that's something that I've learned along the way and trying to capture with neurobiological methods.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really nice recap for us, David. And speaking of running in the rain, I'm a runner, and I did cross country in high school too. And my memorable race was actually snowing in October. So very similar. It shows how mindset and you talk about interdependence and especially for athletes, right? And we'll talk about physical and emotional health. But how much just the way that we perceive and experience can have a cascading effect down to our biology and like for you finishing top 3 and surpassing that 6-minute mile for people that don't run, that's really fast, right? So that's amazing, and I would love to explore the concept of interdependence by helping us understand what is spiritual health, because you talk about this a lot in your work, and you talk about self-transcendence. And I think this is more important than ever, because this question leads up to a follow-up question is, how does it address the crisis of meaning that humanity is facing right now?
Yeah, big sigh there. Well, if dependent origination and interdependence tells us that everything arises from a web of causes and conditions, then spiritual health is about becoming conscious of that web and learning how to participate it in I think with wisdom, in a wise manner, right? So in a nutshell, I can say that spiritual health isn't really about religion. It's about connection. I often, when I talk about the benefits or the reason or the motivations to meditate, I don't say that it's meant for you to sit in a corner on the cushion and learn how to decrease your stress and optimize performance. Those are sort of side effects. the real sort of goal of practice is connection, human connection, right? So that's where spiritual health, I think, starts to become really critical to our experience of being human and physical and mental health. So yourself, others, and you really being larger than you. There's this experience that we refer to as self-transcendence, which really means expanding beyond the ego's constant me-centered narrative. I often talk about I, me, mine complex, and how a lot of our experience is rooted in this construct of I, me, mine. Everything's related to ourselves and our possessions and how we relate to the world. But there's something about spiritual experience and spiritual well-being that uh, allow us to gain a deeper insight into the nature of that experience of self, I, me, mine. And I can just say about just a perspective on spirituality and science. Even 10 years ago, people weren't really, it was kind of behind the curtain. People didn't talk about it very much in science. I think science is finally starting to catch up, because before 1990, I looked up at the research, the number of papers that have been published on spirituality at all, talking about spirituality. It was under about 60 papers before 1990 with the word spirituality in the title or abstract. So it wasn't a lot. That's not very much. But in 2021, there was about 1,000 papers on spirituality. So there is this scientific reawakening that's happening that is clearly addressing the need, like you said, for this sort of the sort of mental health crisis that we're going through, feelings of isolation. There's a lot of challenging times for people. And so I do think that research now shows that people who cultivate spiritual practices, whether it's prayer, meditation, compassion, pranic healing, often you see the data. They live longer, they recover faster, they show lower markers of things like inflammation. And you have to take note, because there was one survey, a national survey, at least in the US, that looked at 2,500 adults. And they said that of those 2,500 adults, they found that about 35% use prayer specifically for health concerns. And there was another Pew Research Center study that showed that 70% of adults, US adults, describe themselves as spiritual in some way. So I think that data point is pointing to like a simple truth that spiritual experience and meaning is real medicine. And it speaks to something that recently happened. There's the NIH, the National Institute for Health, and the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health recently invited me to participate in a working group. And they're exploring how to bring spiritual health into the larger framework for what they refer to as whole person health. And for decades, health models have focused exclusively on physical health or mental health. But more researchers, clinicians, policymakers are all realizing that I think that without this spiritual dimension and without acknowledging the meaning, purpose, and connection are important, that we're missing the core aspect of what makes us human. And so I describe spiritual health really in two main dimensions. One is spiritual experience and one is spiritual well-being. And spiritual experience really refers to those fleeting moments of transcendence, when a person feels connected to something larger than themselves. It might be the divine, it might be nature, it might be the universe, or a moment when the sense of I just completely dissolves and you feel this experience of unity with everything. You sort of almost like an out-of-body experience. In fact, I went last night to a cacao ceremony, and that the cacao ceremony was now being used in many different ways, but it was an experience that was deeply out of body. And we did a lot of breath work practices after eating some of the sacred cacao. And there was an experience, I think, that felt, I think, what was unifying was the love that was in the room that we experienced together. So that's kind of a spiritual experience that's fleeting, it's ephemeral, it's intense, really described as transformative, it's subjective, so it's highly personal, it's sometimes very beyond concepts or language. And that reminds us that consciousness isn't confined to the boundaries of our body. It's relational, it's participatory. And that's what's so amazing about having an experience, is that it can be so personal, but at the same time it's the unifying feeling of maybe love and connection that people describe as being powerful. The second dimension is more what I refer to as spiritual well-being. It's more enduring, it's trait-like, it provides a sense of meaning, purpose, and harmony with oneself, with others, with the larger reality. It's how we integrate those fleeting spiritual experiences into our daily life. How do we take those peak moments once they fade and bring them into our relationships with each other? In healthcare, spiritual well-being plays a particularly important role. You see it in hospitals, chaplains, rabbis, spiritual care providers. They're used in the context of feeling uncertainty, right? So serious illness, loss, transitions, this aspect of spiritual well-being provides, I think, counterbalance to that, the fear of the unknown. So hope and faith replace despair. Interconnectedness, purpose, acceptance, and peace provides a lot of solace for people. So those are the two components of spiritual health. And I think now science and NCCIH are bringing those aspects of experience of well-being into the fold of how we understand whole person health and human potential.
Yeah. Yeah. And all this reminds me of what you've said earlier about some of these, ancient practices in Buddhism and in the Vedas, right? They were the modern science back then, right? And I feel like when you mentioned earlier how there were barely any studies using the word spirituality, right? Before the 2000s, and we see this resurgence. And I find that it's a reawakening, as you said, for people and professionals and scientists, and I think it's more important than ever, because, like you've mentioned, there is this sense of interconnectedness. Whether people believe it or not, that they have their own experiences that they can't explain, unless they really see it and embark on it themselves. And thank you for mentioning pranic healing. I am a energy healer, and my lineage comes from the Buddhist lineage too, and that has its own spiritual take. And for me, that's what inspired me to speak to professionals like yourself, because I had my own meditation experiences where I felt this self transcendence, as you've mentioned, and losing my sense of ego and Jason, and expanding my consciousness. So, and I didn't do any drugs before then, or psychedelics. But with that being said, I would love for us to speak on the science behind meditation and mindfulness, and
Mm-hmm.
and how that seems to affect our physical health, right? Because I
Yeah.
think same thing with spirituality, right? Meditation used to be very taboo as well in the research world, but we see this huge influx of research. So can you share with
Yeah.
us, David, sort of the findings on the physical health realm for meditation and mindfulness?
Yeah, I can certainly sort of give sort of the top 5 sort of impacts of meditation on physical health, and so that relates to just the profound impact that these experiences can have on our body and our mind. Um, I'm just thinking about one of my heroes, Carl Sagan, who made the series of Cosmos back in the 70s and 80s. He was very popular, and he said, not only is science compatible with spirituality, it's a profound source of spirituality. So science really is, I think, our doorway into not just validating some of the traditional practices and methods that came from Buddhist traditions or Vedantic traditions or other spiritual traditions, but science is starting to provide us more access, right, to see how these practices can truly transform our mind and brain and body. So with that, we still have a lot to go. Science is still is trying to better understand some of the aspects of energy, for example, that we don't have good measurement for. But we can look at what these practices are doing with traditional methods of health outcomes. And, what's fascinating to me is just, we think about brain. The brain to me is the most fascinating organ. It's only 2% of our body weight, and it consumes 20% of our body's energy. And so it's like, that's 16 times more energy than just skeletal muscles sitting at rest. And it's like if you were running a marathon, the amount of energy consumed by your muscles would equate the amount of energy that your brain is utilizing when it's doing nothing. So it's a very important organ to keep our system running. So that's why I focus a lot on the impact of meditation on the brain. But I'll go into a little bit broader aspects of impact. I think that the top sort of change that you see in the brain, at least from meditating, is this decrease in activity in what we call narrative self-processing. So one of the problems that we find in mental health and dealing with anxiety and feelings of uncertainty is excessive worry, rumination. We start to feel helpless. And that activates a brain network called, you have maybe 10 or 11 brain networks that you can, that neuroscientists can identify. And one of them that happens to be really active, one study showing that it's active about 50% of your life, of your day is spent in this particular network. It's called the default mode network, and it's associated with this narrative self-referential processing. That just means that the story that you continue to tell yourself about your past experiences or thoughts of the future are sustaining activity, and that there have been now a number of labs that have shown, people like Judd Brewer or Lisa Feldman Barrett have shown that mindfulness practice appears to decrease activity in this network, the default mode network, and that is correlated with reduced mind wandering, so thinking about the past or worrying about the future, and reduced just repetitive negative thought patterns that are seen in depression and anxiety. So that would be the first sort of major impact on brain health physically. The other is, I think the second one that I like to point at is how aging and dementia affects the brain. And we know that atrophy happens in major brain circuits after around age 20 years old. You're losing approximately 500,000 neurons a day after 20, which kind of sucks. So by the time you're 40, your brain volume actually decreases by about 5% every decade following 40 years old. That's like 1 million neurons per day after that. So you're losing all these neurons just because of age-related decline. That's just normal everyday aging. So you can see there's a lot of biohacking and longevity trends that are out there to try to keep us healthy. What we see with meditation is that meditation appears to be protective, neuroprotective, that there are specific networks in the brain that are more active. We just said that the narrative self network is decreased in activity, but there's One network in particular you see that's more active is called the frontal parietal control network. And this network is uniquely described as like a circuit breaker or control hub. It coordinates activity, flexible switching or toggling between different types of thinking. And you see this change in how that network is active. You see there are a number of meta-analyses that have been done now by Diego Pizzagalli, Matthew Sackett, Sarah Lazar. I've also been involved with another meta-analysis with Hadley Rawrig and Kirk Warren Brown, showing that connectivity within this network, within it and between it and the default mode network, are increasing. It's how it's efficiently communicating with each other. So it modulates this self-referential thinking in a really unique way. And because it's so active, it's not atrophying like you see in aged individuals. So what I mean is, when you look at people over maybe 50 or 65 years old and who are meditating cross-sectionally across all styles of meditation practice, their brains don't show the same atrophy as people who don't meditate, suggesting that the more we meditate, the more neuroprotective it will be for this for across the brain, but specifically for this frontal parietal control network, which is more active during meditation. So that's two. So two really important findings. Another one that really is, I think, important is that overall meditation practice, breath work is also, and yoga, all the different contemplative practices are reducing or decreasing inflammation. So in general, meditation reduces these pro-inflammatory modulators, cytokines, things like IL-6, TNF alpha, also blood-based markers for cardiovascular disease like CRP. It enhances glymphatic activity, which I'll get to also. I hope to talk to you about that. That's really cool stuff. It's brand new. But in general, you have to think of meditation as a way of reducing the or modulating the stress response circuitry. So you see a lot of stress-related inflammatory changes that happens when we have chronic stress. And there's a number of studies, including work from David Cresswell, Chuck Raison, Melissa Rosenkrantz, showing that meditation not only improves immune functioning, but decreases a lot of these pro-inflammatory cytokines across the body. So that, I think, very exciting work. So that's three. Number four would be that meditation reduces attentional bias. It improves attentional stability, flexibility, and reduces attentional bias. And this means that we have this sort of tendency to be biased towards things that are negative, and that we're showing that meditation can decrease things like avoidance. It can decrease hypervigilance, which takes a lot of bandwidth and consumes a lot of energy. And it enables individuals to face discomfort, engage more with challenging emotions or experiences. It could be related to addiction or chronic pain, but there's a number of studies that show that these attentional skills are strengthened. So stability of attention, flexibility of attention, and attentional bias are all showing improvements as it relates to meditation, and that does translate to physical sort of changes. The last sort of, I think, big finding that I'll emphasize is that meditation improves pain perception and equanimity. So equanimity, I think, is one of the most important concepts that or processes that are influenced by meditation, because it allows you to not only gain access to have meta awareness, which is the sort of non-reactive experience to our every moment. It allows us to see pain-related cues or experience of acute pain. It reduces the unpleasantness and the intensity of perceived pain, and it improves recovery time. So recovery is the key to equanimity. When you have some sort of emotional experience, often what happens is we get stuck and we start thinking about it, and it lasts for long periods of time. It's just what we call stickiness, right? It just gets stuck on thinking about it, and it just takes up too many of your resources, that it interferes with your ongoing task demands, or it engages the stress response for extended period of time. What you see in meditators is the ability to have an intense emotional or physical experience, but then recover from that very quickly. So that enhanced recovery time is what we refer to as equanimity. And we see that experience happening with pain, acute pain, chronic pain patients. There's a bunch of data coming from Fadel Zaidan's lab looking at reduced pain intensity, unpleasantness. There's studies showing that from Richie Davidson's lab that meditators can have activity in brain regions responsible for pain. If they even knew that they're going to experience pain, there's typically a period of time. If you knew that pain was coming, I was going to give you pain to your arm, or put a really hot iron to your leg, that it was coming, you would have this anticipatory experience of pain where your pain network in your brain would activate, worrying about the impending experience. And meditators don't show a lot of activity in the anticipatory phase, but they do show high intense experience of the pain. So it's physical. The physical experience is still there, but they're able to dissociate the emotional experience from that physical one. And once they experience the pain, then the meditators can show a very rapid recovery back to baseline. Whereas the normals who don't meditate will show this increased activity during anticipation. They'll show more activation during the experience of pain, and then it stays high, it stays on for a longer period of time. So those are sort of the 5 sort of real findings physically that I can point to: decreased narrative self-processing, reduced age-related brain atrophy, decreased inflammation, I think more generally speaking, improved attentional regulation, stability, flexibility, and attentional biases are improved, and then improved equanimity, specifically around pain more than anything else, and emotion reactivity. So those are I think, the general sort of aspects of how meditation affects the physical body.
Yeah, and as you were listing all those off, David, I was imagining in my head. I was like, oh, okay, I can see why teenage David Vago was able to run in the rain, for so long and did so well, right? Because you talk about the perception of pain, just kind of recovering faster, being more stabilized in your attention and focus, and not having that decreased self narrative, right? That negative self talk that people have about, and like you mentioned too, like whether it's the rain or someone's gonna give you a shock, right? There's that anticipation already of like, okay, things are gonna be worse, so your body's gonna prepare for it. It's gonna feel worse for your body. So I loved how you explained that science, because for a lot of people that don't understand meditation, without the evidence, it can be really hard to understand. And it can be hard to understand too, as even if you have all this evidence, because it's very much an experiential practice. And for myself, when I had my first sort of really powerful meditation experience, right, it kind of changed me in a way that it coming back, right, when you talk about equanimity, coming back, I felt like, okay, maybe some of these life problems that I consider problems aren't as bad as I thought. But
Mm,
it left me this sense of peace and stillness, which is very interesting, right? Because a lot of these spiritual
yeah,
practices, they talk about how we're spiritual beings having a human experience, and
mhm,
the key is cultivating this sense of stillness, presence, and peace through these practices, which again helps explain a lot of what the modern science is showing. Is like, okay, yeah, it does
yeah,
seem to help. If suffering is impossible to avoid, there's ways of managing it, and by managing it, we can learn and grow and hopefully become better people for it. So I'm curious about your comments in sort of that realm. Sort of, you've listed off all the evidence, but what's sort
yeah.
of the higher take for you after saying all this?
Yeah, I think it's the meta awareness, really. It's the how do we break our maladaptive mental habits that keep us, sort of stuck in these into these sort of negative just patterns of behavior and thinking, right? Like if we see a thought as like something like I am worrying, right? If we just see that thought with meta awareness, meta awareness is really refers to just awareness of awareness, right? So how do we sort of distance ourselves from our own thoughts? And that distance that we can create through meditation allows us to see our patterns of our thinking from a healthier distance, and to then choose to inhibit an impulse, or to behave in a particular way that is more adaptive. And it's the same with our thoughts. So if I say, oh, I'm worrying, you can return. There's a whole practice called stop, for example, and mindfulness teachers will talk about this a lot, where you stop, take a moment, observe, and then proceed. And the idea there is that you're looking at your thought. Oh, I'm worrying again. You gently return to the present. You feel what's happening in your body. You're what you're doing is you're breaking up the neural pathways that feed a habit of, oh, I'm worrying again, and then my body starts to get anxious. I start to ruminate and think about the past, and then you're off to the races, right? Like you're not present anymore, and it could just lead to this sort of lengthened stress response. So there's these things called habit loops, that relate to how we describe habits. um, and there's typically a cue, a routine, and a reward. For example, you feel anxious, that's your cue. You're feeling like, oh, I'm worrying again. You grab a phone because you want to doom scroll, or do something to sort of allay your worrying. Maybe you eat a snack. That's the routine or the behavior. And then I need a reward. So the temporary relief is scrolling. That's the behavior, or eating the snack, which is the reward. So that sometimes leads to negative mental habits. And the brain reinforces that loop always with dopamine, because dopamine is a very powerful conditioning neuromodulator. And mindfulness and meditation will interrupt that habit loop cycle really at the cue stage. It sort of takes the cues, right? It takes those sort of cues that lead to or trigger a negative habit, between impulse and action. And instead of being run or dictated by that habit, you start to see the habit, and that changes everything. Once you start to see it with meta awareness, it allows you to then be more adaptive in how you respond to those cues. So those are I think those are maybe those are the easiest. That's the easiest way to think about the most potent mechanism by which meditation can help with not only mental health, but that leads to improved mindset. Like you were saying, um, you know, even in my experience as a runner, um, and you can see this research in Ali Crum, for example, at Stanford, has looked at just the effect of belief can have a powerful impact on how your experience can transform your health and well-being. there's this great study in the 90s that looked at thousands of people who they looked at the death records, and a questionnaire that came out, I think maybe 10, 15 years prior to their passing, that asked them about their stress. And it found that those individuals who experienced high levels of stress, but perceived the stress as being negative and having negative impact on their health and well-being, had a 35% increased risk of dying prematurely than those people who also had the same amount of stress, that they're reporting high levels of stress, but did not perceive it as having a negative impact on their health. In fact, those people who had high amount of stress in their life, high intensity stress, but did not perceive it as having a negative impact on their health and well-being, had the best health outcomes. So suggesting again that our perception and our mindset have a critical influence over our health and well-being. Just like I said in the beginning, the Buddhists were talking about this, 2,500 years ago. We're just finding the science now that's important.
And that reminds me, speaking of Buddhism, my teacher, the founder of pranic healing, says also that suffering comes from inaccurate perception, which leads to inappropriate action and expression from that inaccurate perception. And therefore, on the flip side, right, happiness comes from accurate perception, which is what you're talking about, this meta awareness. And for those that, one of the best examples I think of is like when you're reading a book, right? You could be verbally dictating the words, but your mind could be in, outer space, right? Thinking about something else. And I find the process of me catching myself, mind wandering is also the process of catching myself, like you said, doing certain patterns and negative habits and routines, but catching that cue, right? Catching that cue right before you jump into that pattern, which, mindfulness meditation, trains us in a way. And, you speak about stress too. And it's amazing because I think that, if more people understood this, and really took it to heart, I think the world would be a much better place, which we'll get to. But I would love to touch on the glymphatic system, because you speak about how this system was recently discovered, and it's really important for it. It happens in our sleep, but it seems to also happen during meditation as well. So can you share some of the findings for us?
Yeah, I can. So I should start with maybe what is the glymphatic system, right?
Yeah.
The glymphatic system was discovered by a Danish cell biologist, Mike Nettegard, and there was some work that was done before her time, but she's done the majority of the work since then. And she published a paper in 2012 that specifically looked at this system, which as a metabolic clearance system, really. So it clears all the interstitial solutes that's critical for tissue homeostasis. It's all those sort of proteins from fluid and interstitial space that's metabolic waste is removed. You really think of it as the good kind of brainwashing. And what Mike and Nettegard found, she's at the University of Rochester Medical Center in 2012, that they found that when you basically inject a tracer into the CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, and watch where it goes, that they were able to trace using 2-photon imaging, and this specifically in mice, they did this, and they can see where the CSF was flowing. And the idea was, is there a system in the brain that in which that you can follow certain tracts of movement of CSF through the brain, through the penetrating arteries that go down into the brain parenchyma. And they found that indeed, that the tracer would go through this. There was an influx of cerebrospinal fluid. There was an exchange with interstitial fluid, which is really the fluid that's between brain cells, and that they found that it then has a particular emptying into the venous system. So, really, what we know about this system is that it's super active at nighttime, that it's facilitated by glial cells, that these glial cells called astrocytes, well, they have these end feet that basically wrap themselves around the endothelial cells of our blood vessels, and they create a space, an actual channel of space for interstitial fluid and cerebral spinal fluid to move at high volume and high rates of volume during nighttime. These channels that are created by these glial cells moving or wrapping around these penetrating arteries in the brain increase their volume by about 60% when you're sleeping. And we know that it operates primarily at sleep. It's what's responsible for the restorative benefits of sleep. It leverages the pulsatility of the arterial blood flow to drive these fluids through these interstitial spaces. And when it mixes with the interstitial fluid, it clears all these metabolic waste products. And so we had back in 2021 or maybe 2020, my colleagues and I at Vanderbilt University were wondering if meditation had any influence on this system of the glymphatic system. And so what we did was we really, it's so my team there is Manus Donahue, who is the principal investigator, along with myself. And then when I left Vanderbilt, I became a consultant on the study. And we really just wanted to know, does mindfulness modulate the neurofluids similarly to sleep? Because we know that sleep has this profound effect on the system. It increases activity in it, and it has restorative effects. We know that people with dementia have dysregulation of the system. We know that as you get older, you sleep less efficiently, and it has a detrimental effect on your cognitive capacity. It leads to increased risk for neurodegenerative diseases. So there would be a lot of great benefit if we could see that meditation can improve some of the benefits you get from sleep on the system. So we took expert meditators and we put them in a scanner. And what we could do in the scanner is you can actually look specifically at how these neurofluids are moving across a lot of the sagittal spaces. So wherever there's space, wherever the ventricles, the aqueduct, you can look at flow rates, and the amount of flow that you see can be measured. And there are now indices that have been created in the last maybe 5-10 years that suggest it's related to the glymphatic system, how it clears out all the metabolic waste. And so we asked the question, is there a relationship between meditative expertise and style that could have an effect on the system? So they had meditators with formal experience of at least 111 hours, which we just wanted to have people who had a lot of experience. And that translates to something like 10 years of practice at doing something like 4 times a week, 20 minutes per day for at least a year. So they have a lot of experience. And we wanted to start with a breath focus or focus attention practice for a number of reasons I won't go into now, but I'll just say that we looked at that style of meditation first. And we had we know that when people meditate, they slow their breathing down by a few breaths per minute. And what we were concerned about was that the breathing changes could have a direct effect on the glymphatic system. So we had to control for that. And the way we controlled for that was we would have another group of individuals who are non-meditators who who asked to pace their breathing to the same rate, around 10 to 12 breaths per minute, which is what the meditators were doing. So they started off at about 13 breaths per minute, and when they started meditating, they went down to about 10 to 12 breaths per minute. So we had a second group that just did 10 to 12 breaths per minute. And then we compared them. We also looked at sleep deprived individuals too, but the main focus was on the meditators versus the non-meditators who were just breathing at the same rate as the meditators. And what we found was amazing to us, that indeed, not only were the meditators having different, actually what we found is that the decreased CSF activity through the aqueduct during the mindfulness meditation practice, and that the non-meditators had this increased flow that corresponds to dysfunctional glymphatic activity. So it seems like you want to activate the system and have increased flow, but if there's lots of space, if the brain is atrophied, there's a lot of extra space for the neurofluids to sort of move around. And with every cardiac cycle, you see this sort of washing of the fluids throughout these spaces, these ventricles, the aqueduct. And we know that that's inefficient. It has to move at a slower rate across these different spaces to have a strong effect on waste removal, and that the meditators were showing that they had improved efficiency in the glymphatic system in comparison to the control group that we had. So that was a huge effect. And we looked also at different markers at different parts of the cardiac cycle. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't just the heart rhythm that was driving the effect, or wasn't the breathing that was driving the effect, but it was the actual meditation that had an impact. So we looked also in comparison to the meditators during a mind wandering state where they were not meditating, and in comparison to the mind wandering state during the meditation, those CSF flow changes were significantly different. Again, another suggestion that meditation itself impacts the glymphatic system activity. So not only do we see that meditators versus non-meditators show different flow rates and flow activity, significantly different from each other, but that within meditators themselves, while meditating, they show changes in these CSF flow rates while meditating in comparison to non-meditative mind wandering during rest. So that was the sort of the take home, and that's now in press at Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. We're waiting for it to be published, so we're very excited about this this data, and I think what it speaks to is kind of very related to what you do with the pranic healing and energy. We're actually writing a paper now with a Tibetan medical doctor and medical anthropologist, Tani Tidwell, about the relationship between the glymphatic system and these this network of interconnected channels. So whether it's the vascular, neural, extracellular systems, the interstitium, extracellular space in the body, so the lymphatic system, and in the brain, and the relationship it has with the Tibetan systems or traditional other contemplative traditions or indigenous systems. There's so many examples of systems from different wisdom traditions like Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, that describe energy channels, whether they are Tibetan, or Ayurvedic, they call them nadis, meridians, North Sa. These are conduits for life-sustaining energy like prana, chi, or the lung energy. And so we're trying to make this comparison between those systems of that we see in traditional wisdom-based traditions and in the glymphatics that we're starting to investigate more now. So it's fascinating comparison. I'd love to hear your perspective too, Jason, because when you talk about prana and pranic healing, where do you think it's actually having a physical effect on brain and bodily systems? Because the glymphatic
Yeah.
system may be one of those specific areas that it could be.
Yeah, and I love talking about this, and thank you for sharing, the breadth of the science there, right? Because I think for the audience, they'll appreciate their brain so much more, right, when they're meditating. Now that you telling me, I'm like, oh wow, okay, when I'm meditating, all this is happening. Because personally, I'm also a craniosacral therapist.
Mm.
Before starting, my sort of conventional or functional medicine practice. But to what you're saying, and to give the audience an idea, right? In acupuncture, I'm also an acupuncturist. There's a point on the head called dew 20, which is the 1,000 meeting point, which they say that all these energy channels from the body meet at this top point. And
Mm.
people call it, as a reference, the crown chakra. There's different names for it, as you know. And it makes sense, right? As you talk about the brain, right? How it consumes so much energy in the body, but it sort of has this top down effect on the body as well. Is that the crown center, from my understanding in pranic healing and other energy healing or biofield therapies, is that it's really it's like the blueprint. It's a top down effect, right? So if this is strong, connected, healthy, vital life force energy is flowing through, as you said, right? Not very fast, but maybe slower, more methodically. It has a downstream regulatory effect on the rest of the body. And I've seen it in acupuncture using just needles. I've seen it doing energy healing. I've experienced it personally when I meditate. Because in pranic healing we have a certain meditation practice that focuses on the crown center.
Mm.
So yeah, it's nice to see again, right? We've
Yeah.
pranic healing, and which comes from Tibetan Buddhism. Our lineage goes up to Guru Rinpoche, or Lord Padmasambhava.
Wow.
So my teacher,
There you go.
yeah, there we go. My
Love it.
teacher, Master Choa Koksui, says that his direct teacher is Lord Padmasambhava, or Guru Rinpoche, and Master Choa, the founder of pranic healing, has the same birthday as the founder of Reiki, Usui.
Mm-hmm.
So he says that they're sort of like cousins, and they come from the same lineage there. So it speaks about this interdependence, this Indra's web, how we're all connected, and it's fascinating to me that the science part is confirming a lot of the things that I felt experientially, but for other people as well. So thank you for sharing that, David.
Yeah, no, I think it's just the beginning. Honestly, I think energy has stayed on the side of woo woo, for lack of a better word. You know what I mean? Like people talk about energy and they talk about chakras and the energy channels, but there isn't a good science around it. There hasn't been sufficient science to warrant any observable kind of channels that carry energy. There hasn't been any science to support the idea that there are specific centers in the body that correspond with chakras or any of the other energy channels that you see across traditions, any of the wisdom traditions that we talked about, whether it's Chinese medicine, whether it's Tibetan medicine, whether it's even indigenous groups from, say, the Ketero and the Amazon, or the Andes Mountains, to any other uh, um, uh, wisdom-based contemplative tradition. They talk about these subtle energy channels that carry energy, that have effects on mind, brain, spirit, right? And I think we're starting to at least have an observable system that we can now start to study and look at the influence of these practices that you do with your clients when you try to manipulate prana, right? Manipulate energy, when you manipulate chi through acupuncture. How is it affecting the body? What systems is it impacting? And can we figure out ways to observe those systems? And I think that's where there's giant revolution is about to start. Well, not about to start. It's been starting, but it's starting to take off. Just the fact that you're seeing publications on bioenergy and the energetic field is evidence that there's interest, not only in sort of non-material kind of ways of talking about energy, but looking for physical correlates in the body and the brain that could explain what, why when you do acupuncture, you might feel some tingling or it might relieve pain. Why is that? Aside from just endorphins being released. And we know that. And there may be just, channels that carry this metabolic waste. We know that people with lymphedema, right, have lots of swelling and have cognitive deficits because of the swelling in the body. And so those are channels that are clearly blocked when there's swelling. And we know that when you release that swelling, the cognitive deficits go away. So there hasn't been really good explanations for these things. And, even in Tai Chi or Qigong, there are individuals who are able to move those forces so physically that they're observable, and that are not explainable by science. But I think using these sort of ways of describing the glymphatics in the brain, or lymphatics and interstitial spaces, is now the system for exploring energy, as the way you describe it for prana, or the way that the Tibetans describe lung or tingle. Tingle are really these more subtle energy kind of systems that talk about how we influence each other just through our presence, how nature can influence our bodies, how external forces can influence the rhythmicity of these energy systems. We now know that the glymphatic system is also it has a rhythmicity to it. We saw that similarly to sleep, there's a frequency by which this glymphatic system is pulsing that's not explained by the cardiac cycle or your breathing. That it's partially explained by that, but there's a rhythmicity to it that we don't understand, and that we know is influenced by external forces. If you can entrain the brain, for example, to fire at gamma frequency around 40 hertz, there's evidence now that specifically at that frequency, you can start to move the glymphatic, you can activate the glymphatic channels and flow of CSF through the system, much higher rate than, say, if you use theta stimulation or alpha stimulation. And that there are companies now that are using goggles with light frequencies that are pulsing at this 40 hertz, and sound isochronic tones that just play at 40 hertz, or binaural beats that try to get at 40 hertz. Any way that we can entrain the system to fire at that rate seems to activate the glymphatic system externally. And so we're going to be, I think, finding more and more data that will support the idea that there is a system of energy transport throughout the brain and body. It is influenced by mental states or behavioral states, whether you're sleeping or meditating, that there's benefit to it, and that it's also influenced by external stimulation. So if you use sound, like when you do sound baths, it feels good. Why does it feel good? Potentially it's affecting this glymphatic system. And if you take a step back and think about, well, what is it about meditation that is uh if there's a benefit to meditation on the glymphatic system, you can look at you look at meditators, how they sleep. We always think that meditation is supposed to be really good for sleep, but in fact, if you look at the data closely, you'll see that meditation only improves sleep onset insomnia for people who don't practice a lot. When you're laying in bed and you're ruminating, as we said before, it decreases narrative self-processing. So it could be good for decreasing that self-reflective ruminative processing before what's preventing you from falling asleep. Indeed, there's data to support that. But if you continue meditating and you go on retreat, like you're meditating 10 hours a day, doing lots of meditation, you'll actually see that your sleep is inefficient. You look at your sleep, it's fragmented, you have lots of awakenings. It doesn't look like it fits the model for sleep efficiency. So what's going on there? How can meditation be bad for sleep? Well, if you take the data that we just talked about, that it affects the glymphatic system, right? That it's increasing activity in the glymphatic system. What it's suggesting is that meditation, when you practice meditation, you're getting the restorative benefits of sleep while you meditate, so that you don't actually have the need to sleep as much at nighttime. So even though you may be inefficient with your sleep as we're normally used to, you're still feeling rested, and you're getting the restorative benefits of sleep while you're sitting on a cushion. So you don't need to sleep as much. That is huge. That means that meditation is having that similar restorative benefit as sleep, for all the metabolic waste that has to be removed during the nighttime. Cool stuff. I love
Very
it.
cool. Very cool. As a workaholic, I think you activated a cheat code for me. Just because people talk about, there's only 24 hours a day, and I'm like, well, if I get my meditation in, and that, half an hour meditation is like, I don't know, half an hour or more of sleep, and I'm ready to go. I'm ready to do more stuff.
Yeah.
It's amazing how it's all connected so much again to what I try to share with the audience is the mind body connection, and how that comes in through so many ways, and like you've kind of sort of detailed out, right? Meditation in itself has so many different branching cascading effects on the body that science is still just uncovering. And
Yeah.
and to speak on that, I'd love for the audience to know, David, has there been any meditation experience for yourself that
Mm.
was really profound or significant, that made you think like, wow, this changed my view on reality? Can you share any experience with us to kind of help us
Yeah.
ground this information?
Yeah. It does. When that question really triggers for me, my first experience really was when I first went to a Vipassana retreat. That first time, um, going for 10 days into complete silence, um, it actually opened up a lot of insight into how, um, you know, meditation itself is a form of profound insight into our mental habits, and how we have some access to how that that those processes work. Um, so I think sometimes that feeling of that deep sort of out of body or disembodied experience can be scary for people, right? It's because you're sort of losing a sense of your own identity. Um, but it's also at the same time feeling how um, this transcendent experience of that feels that you're no longer just one independent self that um, is lonely in its own world. You're connected to everything. That I think that was the profound experience I had, is that I may be nothing compared to what's out there in the world, and feeling that sort of insignificance of a self, my own self, and my own ego. But the feeling of connection to all things was probably the more profound experience that that led me to want to explore the science behind it. How can we leverage that feeling and experience of being connected to everything uh, to improve our or reduce our suffering and improve our flourishing as human beings?
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. That reminds me of my first, one of my first almost meditation out of body experiences. And when I came back, I had to do laundry, so I brought my laundry basket down to the washer, and I had the feeling of hugging my washer. I don't know. I just felt this love for
Oh, wow.
everything, and I was looking at my clothes, looking at my laundry
Yeah.
basket. I was like, "Oh, this is so beautiful." And like you said, this sense of impermanence in what they call sunya, or I think nothingness, right?
Hmm.
Also is very resonant with me, because it's like, oh well, at the end of the day, um, we might not be as significant as we'd like to think, with our human egos, but nonetheless, like you said, to do a greater good, and especially with your work, there's a lot more meaning that we can grab from that, and hopefully evolve and grow to uh, experience what it means to really be human. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and just add to that, it's sometimes we feel like there has to be something dramatic happening, right? Like there has to be some fireworks that go off when we're feeling awakened in some way or enlightened, right? When we try to understand what awakening is or enlightenment is, it's sometimes we find ourselves searching for something that's beyond our common experience, and it's a paradox because there is nothing to attain. There's nowhere to go. Your experience is right here, right now. This is whether you go to the top of, you hear the story. Um, you go to the top of Everest to find your peak experience when you can experience it right here, right now, wherever you may be. Right. So we feel sometimes that we're far from the peace and joy that we long for. We tell ourselves if we try harder, follow the right steps, or that we have a particular mindset, or we follow what someone else is experiencing, that there's a success that other people have, and that maybe if we did what they did, we would be enlightened like they are, right? But this longing often leads us just to compare ourselves to others. This social comparison happens all the time, right? And we just need to know that um, that the truth that we're really seeking is waking up to um, the what has Thich Nhat Hanh says it, the illusion of our separateness, right? No one's else's journey can be ours, and everyone's journey is each other's reflection of our own experiences. That we're all connected, we're all interdependent on these causal nexus of connections, and if we realize that, then love becomes a stronger force for all of us to stay true to ourselves, and to feel like we have a responsibility to the planet, and taking care of each other.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful, and I love that quote by Thich Nhat Hanh as well.
Oh,
And
yeah,
I find that yeah, just so many of the luminaries of all these amazing traditions have spoken the same thing, right? Which is service, right? And once you know who you are, from my teacher in pranic healing, the core of the soul is service. So when you have really experienced, you know, the saying "know thyself," right? The only thing else to do is to provide, is to serve, it's just to help people love and grow.
absolutely. And to look at the that we're all connected, right? At the most bit, the Dalai Lama, I saw him recently in Dharamsala, and he says the same thing over and over again. Often, he'll say, we may have many differences amongst us, but at the most basic fundamental level, we are all the same. We all
Mm.
want the same love, joy, and happiness. So that's what we need to nurture in ourselves, is to connect, even if we're politically polarized on different ways of thinking. We can connect at least at the fundamental level that we all want love and joy and happiness. And so let's all try to just get along, right?
Yeah, yeah, amen to that. And if
Yeah.
people, speaking of, would love to connect to you, David, on your work and your books and services, where can they find you at?
Yeah, so you can explore my work at contemplativeneurosciences.com. I share research insights, practical resources. If you want to learn how to meditate, there's opportunities there to learn. I have publications and other partnerships with organizations like the Mind and Life Institute and our society, the International Society for Contemplative Research. These are all great resources for ways to dive deeper into the intersection, really, between neuroscience or science in general and contemplative practices. So yeah, check us out.
Perfect. Amazing. And for the audience, I will leave all those linked down below in the description. And thank you again, David, for today's wonderful conversation. I loved how we started with the science, but kind of ended more on the philosophy and contemplative part, which again, it's two sides of the same coin for us both, and trying to share this awareness with the rest of the world that, like you said, we are all interconnected, and everyone comes from the same fundamental need and search, which is for love, and to be loved, and to give love in ways that are meaningful. And I think what you shared about today with meditation and all the amazing effects it has on our physical and mental and emotional health is really, really profound. And I'll definitely be keeping those insights for myself when I'm doing my own meditative practice there. So thank you again, David. And for the audience, if this episode has resonated with you, please share this episode with a friend, a family member, or a colleague that you would think would benefit from David's work and teachings. That's it for today's episode. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We will look forward to seeing you on the next episode. And thank you again, David.
Thanks, Jason. Really enjoyed being with you today.